Your book, On Tyranny, was an inspiration for many Hong Kong protesters. And we've seen in Hong Kong in recent months a lot of events happening, this new national security law, the arrests of opposition lawmakers. So how relevant do you think that the lessons from your book, written in a US context from 20th century Europe lessons, is for Hong Kong?
Well, first of all, I want to say that that's really a question for people in Hong Kong themselves. For me as the author, it's been very heartening to see that the book has been used by people beyond the US and around the world. I was trying to take the things I understood about the history of the rest of the world and apply them to the United States. And then what's happened is that the book has become at least as important in the rest of the world as it has been in the US. So are the lessons relevant? I think what I have learned from protesters is that they are relevant. If people are able to take the lessons and apply them in their own countries, that means they are relevant. And I think particularly the first few lessons of the book about standing out and about not obeying in advance and about corporeal politics, that is protesting, are relevant in Hong Kong and a lot of other places right now.
And also in your book, you describe tyranny based on some of the ideas of the American founding fathers as the usurpation of power by a single individual or group, or the circumvention of law by rulers for their own benefit. So I'm wondering how you would define tyranny for the modern context, and when do we know when we are living under tyranny?
I think in the modern context, you define tyranny in opposition to two things. You define it in opposition to democracy. So democracy is not an American idea, it's a general idea. It's the idea that every person should be represented and equally represented. And when that's not true, when you don't have a vote or your vote is not equal to other people's votes, then that's a modern tyranny. The second idea against which to define tyranny is the rule of law. So if the laws are not just, or if the laws are unequally applied from one place to another or from one person to another, then that's also a kind of modern tyranny.
So I'm wondering now, we're seeing the emergence of major protests in Belarus, Thailand, Lebanon, and also from Hong Kong last year. Why do you think that there are so many protests happening at this point in time?
Well, generally speaking, it's because authoritarianism is on the rise around the world. The systems that are authoritarian, like China, are becoming more so. And then there are systems like the American one, which are tilting towards authoritarianism. That's one thing. There's a general global trend. I think another thing is that people have realized that the internet, rather than liberating on its own, has to be used as a tool to get people to liberate themselves. So successful protests like Ukraine 2014, Hong Kong last year, Belarus now, are protests where people are using the internet to get other people to do things, like to go out on the street. I think that's a big turn in consciousness where people realize that sitting and looking at a screen is not itself political activity. If you want to have political activity, you have to actually show yourself and meet other people in a physical space and take some kind of a risk. But I think another issue is generational. In Belarus, these are people who have been under the same ruler for a very long time. In Hong Kong, judging from afar, I mean, you would know better than me, but it seems like these are young people who are looking at their last chance to have a free city slip away, right? So I think part of it is also that vision of how a future could be worse than the present.
And also, I saw in your recent op-ed in the Washington Post about what Americans can learn from Belarus. You mentioned that there are echoes of Hong Kong, on the streets of Belarus. So this, I guess, information sharing between these protest movements. Why do you think that's happening now?
Well, I think for one thing, I mean, just as a matter of fact, protesters communicate among one another. For another, it's because people observe tactics. They see what other people are doing. So, I mean, I know as a matter of fact that people in Belarus observed demonstrations in the US and observed demonstrations in Hong Kong. So in particular, the tactic of not having only mass demonstrations, but having small dispersed demonstrations which get across their message and then disperse before the police can do anything. That's something that's a tactic which is spread outward from Hong Kong. So I think it's normal that protesters learn from one another. It's also probably necessary.
And do you think it's also the case that states are learning from each other? Because we're seeing in Belarus, similar to what they did in Hong Kong, they are describing the protests as, an emerging color revolution sparked by foreign interference. How do you think that states are learning from each other in that aspect?
So what strikes me here, Sarah, is the universal lack of imagination. So whether it's China or Belarus or the United States or Russia, the leaders who try to break up demonstrations always say the same things. They say, these were inspired from abroad. These do not have the support of the people in general. This is a national security threat. I mean, I don't know if they're copying or just if there's a total lack of imagination among 21st century tyrants, because no longer is anyone repressing in the name of something. It's always repression in the name of these sort of very conservative status quo generic principles like stability, right, or sovereignty. Everyone is saying exactly the same thing. So I'm not sure if they're actually copying or if just tyrants in the 21st century no longer have any positive vision or any kind of ideology which is meaningful.
But do you think that the protests we're seeing now will be effective in countering tyranny? Do you think that they will be successful?
They're much more effective than the absence of protests. I mean, it would be historically foolish to say that every protest works, but if you protest, your chances are much better than if you don't protest. And sometimes what history shows is that protests at one moment, for example, solidarity in Poland in 1980, then years later or a decade later have their consequence. So sometimes protests, even if they fail at one moment, create a generation, create experiences, and create norms that people can then profit from later on. So it's impossible to say whether any protest is going to succeed, but it's certainly better than not protesting most of the time. And going back to your question about the global, I think it's very important for Americans to see other people protesting for democracy. Americans are a little bit confused about what to do because they tend to think of themselves as automatically democratic. And now that that's not true, what are we supposed to do? And it does help to look around the world and see that other people actually have ideas about what to do. So if you're taking part in a protest and you're on the right side, you can also know that what you're doing is setting an example for other people.
And also what's interesting is that these protests are happening at the time of a global pandemic. And in your book, you talked about, favorable emergencies and how authoritarians like to exploit that. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about how you see different regimes exploiting the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very wide spread here. So you have, there's some governments like America, Brazil, Russia, where a strongman figure tried to exercise his will against the pandemic and failed. And then those are the countries where the pandemic is killing more people. Then you have a country like China, which was already an extremely technologically advanced authoritarian regime, which has used the pandemic simply to move further in that direction, and has done relatively well with the pandemic, but which has used it as a justification to become even more intrusive into the lives of its people. Then you have authoritarian countries like Hungary, which have used the pandemic in a very traditional way, have used the pandemic as an excuse to close down democracy, to say we need special powers. This is an emergency. The word you used, emergency, is the crucial word. Every time, I mean, the classic way to turn a democracy into a tyranny is to declare an emergency and then to have that emergency become permanent.